Hello and welcome to my talk about alternative magnetic quasiparticles. So here I want to consider several nano objects that are related to skyrmions, but in some cases exhibit advantageous properties, so that we can use them in spintronics. My name is Börge Göbel. I am from the theoretical group of Ingrid Mertig at the Martin-Luther-Universität in Halle in Germany. And if you find this topic interesting, please have a look at our review paper that we have published earlier this year. So I guess in this section you have already learned quite a lot about magnetic skyrmions. And one of the reasons why they are so interesting is that they have such high stability and they exist even at small sizes. And since we can write, delete, move and read them, we can propose to construct such a racetrack data storage device as was proposed by Stuart Parkin. So what you can do is you can transfer this electrical signal of ones and zeros into a sequence of skyrmions. And since you can move these skyrmions based on electrical currents and you do not have to consider mechanically moving parts, this can be quite advantageous. And even more so, you can stack these individual racetrack layers along all three dimensions, which will drastically increase the storage capacity of your device. Besides that, the skyrmions are very interesting because of their emergent electrodynamics. So here we have the topological Hall effect and the skyrmion Hall effect. So for the topological Hall effect, you have the electrons and their spins moving through the skyrmion texture. And since the spin reorients upon traversing this texture, the electrons will accumulate a Barry phase and they will be deflected by the corresponding magnetic field, which is proportional to the density of the skyrmions in your sample. And then, on the other hand side, we have the skyrmion Hall effect, because when these electron spins reorient, also the magnetic texture of the skyrmion itself will reorient. And if you look at this collectively, this will look like a motion of the skyrmion. And since the skyrmion is tomologically non-trivial, this will occur at an angle with respect to the electric field. And this is what we call the skyrmion Hall effect. So here you can see what happens in this so-called spin transfer torque scenario. So the skyrmion will be pushed towards the edge and then it may creep along the edge for quite some time, but at some point the skyrmion will just annihilate and then our information is lost. So this is the effect that we must ultimately suppress. And this is what I want to aim at in this talk. So if we do not want to consider this spin transfer torque scenario, we better use the spin orbit torque scenario, where we have a bilayer of a ferromagnet and a heavy metal, and our electrical current will be translated by the spin Hall effect into a spin current that you can see in orange here, or in yellow. So we have these spins S that will be injected from the perpendicular direction. And if we now look at the Thiele equation, which is the effective equation of motion, it looks like this. So here you see v is our velocity of the skyrmion, and then we have several terms that act or that describe the motion of our skyrmion. So most interesting, I think, are here the first term and the third term. The first term is the gyroscopic vector, or includes the gyroscopic vector g, and this is proportional to the topological charge. And therefore, because we have this vector product here, it will always be perpendicular to the velocity, as you can see here. But then also we have this term here, where we have another tensor I that describes basically the in-plane magnetization profile of our skyrmion. And if we tune this correctly, we could even suppress the transverse component of the gyroscopic force. So we can tune G, we can tune I. How can we do this? We have to use alternative magnetic quasiparticles. So here in our review paper, we have considered quite a lot of them, but I want to discuss here mainly the AntiSkermion and the Biomeron, because I think they are quite unique and quite interesting, even though they are very much related to the conventional skyrmion in terms of their topology. But first let me start with something more simple, the skyrmionium and the antiferromagnetic skyrmion. So using these two objects, I would say is the most simple thing you can do in order to suppress the skyrmion Hall effect, because you can immediately see, okay, then the topological charge of these objects is 0, and therefore the gyroscopic term will be absent, and this means we have no skyrmion Hall effect. I think it's really quite simple. And the whole trick here is to combine two skyrmions with opposite topological charges. So here for the skyrmionium, you can put one skyrmion inside of the other, and for the antiferromagnetic skyrmion, you can, for example, consider such a bilayer, or you can even put them both in the same layer and consider two sublattices. So here I think it's quite easy to understand that they will not exhibit a skyrmion Hall effect. However, it's also possible to consider objects that have a topological charge, and this includes these AntiSkermions and these Biomerons here. And the whole trick is that they have a lower symmetry in terms of their in-plane magnetization. So what this means, for example, is you can rotate them, and this will change the tensor of I. And then, therefore, the corresponding forces will reorient. So here you can see it once again. You have, by choosing a different type of in-plane texture, you manipulate this tensor D, and you manipulate this tensor I, which is more important. And what this means is you reorient the corresponding force, which is this one here, the spin orbit related force that is characterized by I. And when you are at the ideal configuration, you will see that the transverse component of this force compensates the gyroscopic force, and then in this case the skyrmion velocity will be parallel to the applied current. So this is really what we want. So I want to start with the magnetic Biomeron that we have proposed in this paper in 2019, and you can consider a Biomeron that you can see here as an in-plane skyrmion, because you can take a skyrmion and rotate all of the magnetic moments around the y-axis, or you can consider it a Biomeron because you can see it consists out of this blue and out of this red part, which is an antimeron and a meron with opposite out-of-plane magnetizations. So both of these will have the topological charge of -1/2, so this one has the topological charge of -1, exactly the same as the skyrmion. And when we rotate this Biomeron, you can come up with this ideal configuration of the forces, which is where the skyrmion Hall effect will be absent. And later in that year, the Biomeron has been observed in such a geometry here, where you see a dark dot and a white dot, which corresponds to a vortex and an anti-vortex. And you can see here, this configuration looks very similar to our configuration. All right, so in our simulations, we have considered Monte Carlo simulations. And here I just want to show you that the phase diagram looks kind of similar to skyrmions. So at small in-plane fields, you get a helical phase. Then at finite fields, you get the Biomeron crystal. And then at large fields, you get the ferromagnetic phase. And at the transition, you get a few individual Biomerons. This is just like for the skyrmion material. However, you must not need to apply an out-of-plane field, but an in-plane field, because the net magnetization of a Biomeron is in-plane. So we have already discussed the current-driven motion. It's similar to other objects like the AntiSkermion that I will discuss next, and it is based on these anisotropic features in the skyrmion Hall angle. And another very interesting effect that I want to mention here is the topological Hall effect. So here I have already discussed that the net magnetization of the Biomeron is in the plane, and therefore also the stabilizing field is in the plane. So this means these two vectors are perpendicular to the emergent field of the Biomeron. So this means that the topological Hall effect enters a different tensor element as the conventional Hall effect or the anomalous Hall effect, which means we think that you may be able to detect this effect in an individual manner, while for skyrmion all of these three effects will be superimposed. Now for the AntiSkermion, the logic is quite similar. You can see it's not rotational symmetric, and therefore you can come up with a particular configuration where the skyrmion Hall effect is absent. And for example, you can see here along this line, it looks like a nail domain wall here as well. And when you would look along this line here, it would look like a Bloch domain wall. So this means when you apply your current along different directions, the AntiSkermion will behave differently. So the idea in this collaboration with Stuart Parkin's group and Jagannath Jenner here, who did the experiments, was to prepare racetracks that are cut along several crystallographic directions. And you can see here two of these racetracks of a Heusler material, where you can really see, okay, the contrast of these AntiSkermions changes. And the connection between these two white parts here, which corresponds to the Bloch parts, is always along the 1, 0, 0 direction. So it really matters along which crystallographic direction you prepare your racetrack. Okay, so let me summarize up to this part. We have learned that several alternative nano-objects can be used to suppress the Skyrmion Hall effect. This can be done based on the compensated topological charge, like for the skyrmionium and the antiferromagnetic skyrmion, but also we can use objects with a lower symmetry based on the in-plane magnetization. However, suppressing the Skyrmion Hall effect is not the only thing that we must accomplish. So you can see that here another problem is the diffusion and also repulsive and attractive interactions. So for example, when you look at a sequence of bits of zeros and ones based on this present and absent skyrmions at these positions, when you wait for a long time, the sequence of skyrmions will become equidistant. And this means the position of the bits will change. And this means, yeah, our information is basically useless and it will change over a long time. So this is something we must suppress, or an effect that we must overcome. And so here I want to explain to you our results in this experimental collaboration with Stuart Parkin's group. And what we have found is that in Heusler materials, elliptical Bloch skyrmions and antiskirmions can coexist. So here you see a study at low temperatures, 200 Kelvin, where we see these elliptical skyrmions with a topological charge of 1. And here at a higher temperature you see the antiskirmions that have the opposite topological charge. And exactly at a critical temperature, which is 268 Kelvin, and in this case, we see a coexistence. And we even see this in such a racetrack geometry. So this means we can propose a racetrack storage device that is based on two distinct carriers of information. So we have 0 bits that correspond to antiskirmions and 1 bits that correspond to skyrmions. And in this case, the distance between the bits does not matter. It can change over time and the information will remain invariant. So this makes our device much less susceptible. And a very last project that I want to discuss here is that recently we have theoretically analyzed the bubbles in these materials, in these Heusler materials. And since we have there such a anisotropic Dzieloszynski-Moria interaction, which is based on the crystal structure, we find that these topologically trivial bubbles come in 4 distinct varieties that are rotated by 90 degrees. And they are also separated by considerable energy barriers. So they are very stable and we can change one from the other. And also in this experimental study here, they have been observed in the material. So this solves problem A, of course, because they have a trivial topological charge. They move without the Skyrmion Hall effect. So this is just like for the antiferromagnetic skyrmion, for example. And since we have several distinct objects, we can propose such a new type of racetrack storage device, which is again less susceptible to diffusion and repulsive interactions. So it could be very interesting to search and investigate more on these bubbles here. Okay, so with that I want to summarize. I have briefly discussed the skyrmionium and the antiferromagnetic skyrmion, and then in detail I have discussed the Biomeron, the AntiSkermion and the bubble. And what we have found is that all of them are very interesting because they have a compensated Skyrmion Hall effect. They exhibit unusual topological Hall signatures, and some of them can even coexist. So with that, I'm at the very end of my talk, and I want to kindly thank the co-authors and the collaborators, most importantly Ingrid Mertig, Stuart Parkin, Jagannath Jenner, and Oleg Tretyakov. And I want to thank you, the audience, for your attention.